this period of time, which was a pressure cooker in Jewish intellectual history, when three movements in particular vied for the loyalty of European Jews, and in many ways shaped the character and trajectory of Jewish history for the next 200 odd years. We are still in many ways, dealing with the fallout and the implications of this intellectual conflict at the time. The three great groups, of course, are the Hasidic, the Misnagdic or Mitznagdic, and the Maskilic movements. I'll explain what each of those mean. But if you have a look at this map, which gives you some sense of Jewish population concentrations in Europe, the Hasidic movement was, and this is just a very rough diagram, but the Hasidic movement was concentrated towards the eastern and southern part of Europe, primarily in the region of Poland and Ukraine. Chabad is a little bit of an exception with much more Lithuanian roots. And then there's the reaction to the Hasidic movement, the so-called Mitznagdic or opponents movement, that tended to have more of its concentration towards the north, towards the region of Lithuania, Latvia, Prussia, and so on. And then finally, the Maskilic movement, which is concentrated primarily in the western part of Europe, northern Germany as well, with a large overlaps. And since it is a Venn diagram, you can see that there are regions in which Hasidim, Misnagdim, and Maskilim, which is the term used for the adherents of the Haskalah, more or less coexisted with a certain amount of friction, ultimately with a degree of rapprochement that I hope to explain over the course of this brief lecture. So we're going to look at these three movements, how they started, how they defined themselves relative to each other, and perhaps we'll have a moment to reflect on what it means for the 21st century as well. First of all, let's begin with the Hasidic movement. So this is my colleague, Professor Moshe Rossman, who was a tremendous researcher who primarily was working with the history of Polish nobility when the Soviet Union fell. And as a result, he took advantage of the new opportunities for scholars in the West to actually explore Soviet and Soviet bloc archives. Amazingly, he went there and he found that one of the most difficult aspects of the early Hasidic history is that we are almost entirely reliant on a difficult book from a historical perspective, Shivchei Habesh, in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, the great founder of the Hasidic movement. We have very little historical data about his actual life. This document was composed well after his passing. It is difficult from a historical perspective, not only in terms of the gap between the lifetime of its subject and the composition of the book, which is based primarily on oral traditions, but also because it is heavily characterized by materials that historians are reluctant to work with, miracle stories and things like that. So there is even questions in the academic world whether or not the Baal Shem Tov even existed until Professor Rossman went and found his 1040, found his tax receipts in the Polish archives, which demonstrated that, in fact, he did live in Medjugorje in southern Poland, which would be western Ukraine today. You can see here the lines highlighted. It says Baal Shem. That's actually what he was known as, the Baal Shem, the master of the good name. Rossman's work really corrected a lot of the historical record and verified not only his actual existence, but his relationship to the community, in which he was really a very well-loved rabbinic figure who benefited from tax breaks from the state, recognizing his role as clergy, and really deserving of tremendous study as well. So who was this Israel ben Eliezer? His dates are roughly 1699 to 1760. Some doubt about those specifics, but he founded this remarkable movement that focused on the popularization of regular people's worship, as opposed to the more elitist approach that was characterized by the Lithuanians in the north. By the way, Lithuanians, if you're not familiar with Jewish cultural geography, Lithuanians, or Litvaks as they're known, are characterized in the sort of nomenclature as being Jews with a very high sense of rationality, almost Prussian in their mannerisms. They tend to have a superior fashion sense. and a few other items. Thank you for laughing. I appreciate that. The southern populations of Ukraine in particular felt disenfranchised by a curriculum of status that relied very heavily on the intense training in Talmudic studies that was not well known in the southern region and was far harder for more common Jews to access. So Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, really championed a version of Jewish spirituality that validated other elements and approaches to God, including the camaraderie, the joy of song, of forbringing, of dancing, and all kinds of things like this. There were movements that were, of course, much more intellectually rigorous. Chabad is noted in that regard as well. But this really started a revolution that is continuing to unfold even into the 21st century. However, even though the Baal Shem Tov is considered the originator of this Hasidic movement, they were definitely precursors. This is a photograph of my colleague Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern way back in the 1990s when he was working in the Vernadsky collection of Kiev, and beside him are some of the remarkable 18th century Pinkasim, or community records books, that were stored in the basement of the library through the Stalin era, and he was one of the great scholars who was working on reviving those materials and making them available to scholars today. And his research really emphasizes that the Baal Shem Tov was really building on top of a popular movement that is not very well known of itinerant preachers who would travel throughout the Jewish countryside. And in contrast to the state-appointed rabbis that were frequently corrupt and interested in simply having a shtela and the regular income that came through the state-supported taxes for the Jewish community, and they weren't really taking care of the spiritual needs of the population, there were a number of these so-called Baalei Shem. They were so-called primarily because they dealt in amulets. Shem, of course, means name, like the name of God, and a Baal Shem means someone who has a mastery of that name. And so Baalei Shem were people who would travel from town to town. They would frequently offer sermons in synagogues, and they would also produce Kabbalistic amulets, hence Baalei Shem, masters of the name. There are some scholars who feel that the name Baal Shem Tov implies that Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer was like distinct from all of the run-of-the-mill Baalei Shem. He was the Baal Shem Tov. He was the good Baal Shem, because as you might expect, there's a certain degree of charlatanism that would go along with, selling amulets from time to time. They're not always necessarily that reliable. Although they do have a very long history in Jewish tradition, reaching back into the Talmud, the Kabbalistic literature, and so on, there are many people who would capitalize on people's superstitions to sell invalidated amulets. At any rate, one of the most famous was Hillel Baal Shem, who was a fascinating individual who lived about 60 years before the Baal Shem Tov, and he left an incredible amount of writing, but he refused to participate in print culture. He insisted that his works must be literally hand-copied only, and as a result, by not taking advantage of technology, once again I refer to Chabad, one of the great aspects of the Chabad movement, distinguishing it from many other Hasidic movements, is that the Rebbe was a great early adopter of technology, radio, television, recording. I'm sure the Rebbe would love the internet, and because he adopted these things and he saw them as having a positive purpose. Hillel Baal Shem Tov, however, disagreed and wanted to stay with manuscript technology. Dr. Petrovsky-Stern, shown here, worked with some of his early writings. And although they have not been published yet, he has produced certain excerpts from Hillel Baal Shem Tov's work, which is absolutely fascinating. So at any rate, the Hasidim soon found that they had a tremendous degree of opposition from the so-called misnagdim. The term, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, comes from the word neged, to be against. I say that like a Canadian, against. For those of you who are Americans, I think it's pronounced against, or something like that. So the so-called opponents were actually the traditionalists, meaning the pre-Hasidic Jews. We might call them Litvaks because they were concentrated in Lithuania, and their main sort of like cultural center of gravity was in Vilna. But they received their name because of their attitude towards this early Hasidic movement. This was exacerbated as Hasidism enjoyed a phenomenal spread, not so much under the Baal Shem Tov himself, where it still remained very much a grassroots movement, and not so much under his immediate student, the Maggid of Mezrich, but his 5 Talmidim took the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, now 3rd generation, and spread them far and wide throughout Eastern Europe, as you can see from this map in the Historical Atlas of Hasidism that came out from Princeton University Press a couple of years ago. Among the most important of the disciples of the Maggid was Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, who brought many of these teachings primarily to Lithuania. But it's important to note that as you study the works of the Maggid and the Alter Rebbe and others, it's very rare in their works to identify that Hasidism has a consciousness at that time of itself as a revolutionary movement. For the Hasidim, it was very much a revolution of discovery, meaning, we found all of these tremendous sources, primarily in the works of Rabbi Chaim Vital and the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, that energize Judaism and take us away perhaps from the kind of overwhelming emphasis on logic and analysis that are characterized Talmudic studies, and said, look at all this geschmack material, this tasty, delicious material that helps us really imbibe the spirit of Judaism. Maybe I will pause to tell you a brief joke. I studied primarily, because I'm not a real Chabad, I think, although I do have really super Chabad grandchildren. So that's a good statement, at any rate. And also a daughter and a son-in-law. My daughter became intensely Chabad after just hearing Hayom Yom once a week, Shabbos morning in Rabbi Lipsker's shul. Blew her away, and she could never go back to the Lithuanian derech. Anyway, the joke goes like this. In the Lithuanian institutions in which I trained, Lithuanians emphasize in particular Musar, which is it's a little bit of an overcharacterization, but it is kind of a form of ethical self-development that tends to lean towards self-criticism. Right? It's all about analyzing your fault laws and developing insight into what your problems are. You're delving into those deeply, and then you work your way through solving them. But it tends to be a little bit darker. It's definitely not the same as Hasidus, which tends to be far more positive in nature. So the joke goes like this. A chassid walks into a Lithuanian Musar shtibel, into a center of study of Musar, and he goes into the room and he sees that spread throughout the room there are individual men sitting with books open, like Shevet Musar and Mesilas Yesharim and the great classics of Musar literature. And he sees one person, puts his hand on his head and says, "Oi, ich bin garnished," I'm nothing. And he sees another person sighing and looking up at the heavens with his hands open, saying, what have I done with my life? And he sees that there are people all, they're definitely into it, but they're kind of depressed about their activity. So he says, I'll try it. He pulls a sefer off the shelf, Chovos HaLevavos, he opens it up, he starts reading, and he starts thinking about his flaws and the things he's done wrong in his past, and he says, Oi, ich bin garnished. Ich bin ganz garnished. And he raises his voice as he realizes, ich bin garnished from garnished. And so one of the other people says to the other, look who's the big shot who thinks he's garnished. Okay. So the center, if there is a person who has most personified the Lithuanian movement, is undoubtedly the great Vilna Gaon, who was a tremendous scholar, quite a bit of a loner. He did not run a yeshiva. He studied purely on his own, but a huge cult of personality in a positive sense developed around his incredible discipline and regimen in study and the many remarkable novellae that he left behind in his writings. And it's not exactly clear to what degree he himself was involved in pushing forward the Misnagdic agenda, opposing Hasidism in particular, but it's definitely something that is seen among his disciples. So if we set aside the question of his specific role in it, there's conflicting historical testimony. What were the issues in hand? One of them was that the Hasidim were criticized for organizing separate prayer groups, that the way the communities were organized in Eastern Europe at the time, there were like official state-sponsored rabbis who were functioning in individual community kehilot, communities. And if you were to establish a different time of prayer, for example, which was something that the Hasidim leaned towards, then that meant that there was a fracture in the community. You had split people, had to make decisions. Am I going to make the 730 minyan, the 930 minyan, all kinds of things. So there was an argument that this represented a al tifrosh min hatzibur moment, do not separate from the community. Another criticism was that not only did they set up separate communities, but they ignored mandated prayer times. And this is really more of like kind of a cultural flavor of the early Hasidic movement that emphasized the value of spontaneity and of preparation for prayer. I know those things sound contradictory, but I think it refers really to the way in which individual Hasidim may have responded to that. So for example, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, mandates very specific times of prayer. We have 3 prayer times a day, as you know, Shacharis, Mincha, Marav, the morning, the afternoon, and the evening prayer. And if you go to a Lithuanian shul, they will specifically outline, at what time you can finish saying the Shema, at what time you must say the Shemona Esrei, and so on. And the Hasidic response was, that's all well and good, but you have to be in the right mood to pray. You have to prepare yourself for prayer. So the ones who were very serious would get up early, go to the mikveh, spend a lot of time learning Hasidus, and it would take them that long before they could come to tefillah. The argument that they differed from the traditional Ashkenazic prayer book, adopting the prayer book of the Ari in particular, which is of course the Chabad Nusach, and incidentally, there's a huge economic undercurrent to this as well, because when new communities were established like this, a rivalry for the korobka tax revenue stream was created, and so all of these things had the implications that some rabbis' income was threatened if a new rabbi came into town and established a rival kahila. Same thing with the kosher slaughter and the kosher slaughter tax that went along with it. There was, of course, an issue specifically about the degree to which the blades used for slaughter had to be sharpened. 5, this is more of a cultural argument that they're saying you are ignoring the study of Talmud. This is what has really been the central pillar of Judaism for so many centuries, and now the Hasidim were accused of studying all kinds of other books, including Tanya, to replace the Talmud. And in its place, oh my gosh, studying Kabbalah, which in the Lithuanian movement is regarded as something which is sancta sanctorum, and that you can only study the Kabbalah if you are over the age of 40, have completed all of the Talmud and all of the poskim in advance, you are male, you are married, all kinds of things are involved. And here, regular people are studying digest versions of Kabbalistic doctrines, which are reserved for the elite among the Lithuanians. Tanya is an excellent example of that. And finally, that they were engaged in raucous, unruly, drunken behavior, arguing that, in fact, this is not the way a shul should behave. This Lithuanian ideal of davening. One of the things that we'll get to at the end of this presentation, God willing, is that ultimately the Lithuanians would absorb many elements of Hasidic practice. One of those is shuckling. that the movement during prayer. Ideally, Lithuanians are taught to pray, as we have in the Gemara and Brachos, hands folded over the heart, right over left, and stock still during Shmona Esrei. But you would be hard-pressed to find a young Israel anywhere in the country where people remain stock still. The Hasidic movement, like a flame, Kol Atzmosai, Tomarna Na Hashem, has really become the norm. So these are the basic list of charges. Oh, and the last one, very important, I'm sorry, and you see in many ways they increase in severity, that the Hasidim were accused of engaging in antinomian behavior, meaning actually anti-halachic behavior, not following the law, and even Sabbatianism, the following of the teachings of the disgraced false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi. We'll talk about him, God willing, a little bit more tomorrow. So these are the charges that were laid against the new Hasidic movement by the Misnagdim. The Alter Rebbe and Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk tried to moderate this by meeting with the Vilna Gaon. Again, there's some disputes over how this meeting it did not happen, but why did it not happen? Or did he refuse to see them? Something else. But at any rate, they were unsuccessful in mediating a compromise. And in 1772, we have the first of the bans on the Hasidim, including public burning of books, which never goes well for Jews. Public burning of books is nasty. The Hasidim issue counterbans, other book burnings, and 1781 was when the whole thing was ramped up still to another stage with social bans, more of a cherem kind of approach, where associating with Hasidim was banned by the Misnagdim. And finally, in 1794, it reached a peak in the city of Pinsk, when a Misnagdic rabbi lost a job opportunity to a Hasidic challenger, and he turned to the secular authorities, turned to the Tsarist government, and said, Tsar Nicholas, I'm not sure which Tsar it was at the time, Peter, I think, Peter III. These Hasidim, they are fomenting rebellion against you. They are, challenging the authority of the traditional leaders, and therefore the Tsar, who was always very happy to get involved in internal Jewish disputes, has the Alter Rebbe temporarily jailed, the first of a long series of jailings of Hasidic leaders, and of course there were counter jailings of some Misnagdic leaders as well. But the Misnagdim realized that they were on the losing end of this conflict, and ultimately this was a machlokas l'shem shamayim that would endure, and so the Misnagdim, now under the leadership of the student of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, realized they had to adopt a strategy that would allow them to survive, because Hasidism was simply expanding all over Europe. And so centered in this yeshiva of Volozhin, which was kind of like the most important center of Lithuanian teachings, they developed a few revolutions of their own. First, they doubled down on the study of text. They doubled down on saying, we are not going to move one iota from the text. We are going to really emphasize on greater Jewish literacy. Maybe the subtext was, sorry, we didn't do more of this before, but we are going to definitely, create our niche as being masters of the Talmudic text and making sure that lots more people study it as well. So it was a net gain for Klal Yisrael because more people were studying text as a result. The Talmud in particular, and you see this is more of a 20th century development, but you see this, for example, in the huge success of things like Daf Yomi, which is the world's largest book club and has hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world studying the same page of Talmud a day. This is kind of an expression of this Lithuanian ideal of popularizing Talmud, and they did very well with that. And they even retreated a little bit on Kabbalah. They said, okay, we know that Kabbalah has tremendous power to motivate the Jewish spirit. That when you learn one little tiny Kabbalistic interpretation of a pasuk or a ritual, it can infuse your practice with tremendous energy. And so therefore they said, okay, a little bit of Kabbalah. The greatest text is the Nefesh HaChaim, which was authored by the student of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. It is a remarkable book, and it is largely a response to Tanya, Lithuanian-flavored response to Tanya. I will tell you a personal anecdote. When I was studying in Lithuanian yeshivas in Israel, I called up one of my rebbeim, and we were talking, and he said, "How are you enjoying it?" I said, "Well, Rabbi, it's okay. It's kind of fun, but I go to yeshiva in the morning. We learn a Tosfos, we break it apart, we look at some Rishonim, we break them apart, we go to Shir, and then I come home, and it's like, it feels a little bit like I'm lahavdil doing crosswords every day, or Sudoku. I mean, just this, here's a puzzle, figure the puzzle out, next puzzle. Here's a puzzle, figure the puzzle out. And I was saying, I'm not feeling, the bren, I'm not feeling the burn, the excitement. And he said, okay, what you need to do is read Nefesh HaChaim, 15 minutes a day, no more, just 15 minutes a day. And so I put it into my daily Seder. I would take the bus from where we lived. I was married then in Kataramon Hayashan down to Ma'alot Dafna. I had a 15-minute bus ride. That was my bus Seder. And I frequently found myself missing my stop and ending up in the Shuafat refugee camp because I just could not take my eyes off the page of Nefesh HaChaim. It is an amazing work, really fascinating, and deeply worth it. But it's also an extremely Kabbalistic work. And this was the Lithuanian response saying, okay, we will allow people to study it, but only 15 minutes a day, as it were. And also, one of the things that the Hasidic movement which was really, sociologically very significant, is elevating the role of single charismatic leaders with their strong individual connection to their specific parishioners. The tzaddik is what I'm referring to here. There's a lot of other issues that we won't get into that were critical against the tzaddikim from Lithuanian perspective. And so Lithuanians were not willing to go the same route with kvitlach and things like that, special petitions and so on. But the idea of creating the same kind of role for the Rosh Yeshiva was very appealing. And in fact, that has been the way that the Lithuanian culture has developed, where the Rosh Yeshiva frequently have the same kind of elevated status that they did not enjoy before the 18th century. So that's what's going on here with the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, a conflict that would ultimately be resolved more or less, at least to a kind of a truce, by 1815. But before we talk about them, we've got to talk about the Maskilim. And so this is the greatest known maskil. He's considered the founder of the Haskalah. The term Haskalah is a Hebrew translation of the German term Aufklärung, which means enlightenment. And it is the Jewish take on a movement that swept across Europe that emphasized much more rationality. In the European version, it definitely, and in the Jewish version as well, it represented a decline of traditional religiosity. It was a reflection of the advances of science and the willingness to accept that scientific data had a level of veracity that displaced revealed texts like the Bible. So you have a lot of people who are advancing Enlightenment ideas, Immanuel Kant and others, and it affected Jews as well. Moses Mendelssohn was an unusual figure who was a brilliant individual, and unlike most Jews of his era, the first thing that he really did that was of significance was he mastered the German language. Yiddish and German are very closely related languages. Yiddish evolved out of medieval German. Billy Crystal, the comedian, likes to say that Yiddish is basically German with phlegm. But he mastered the literary form of German, something which gained him tremendous respect. He even competed with the aforementioned Immanuel Kant in an essay competition and beat him, which is remarkable given that Immanuel Kant was one of the leading figures of the 18th century. And he essentially advocated a vision of Judaism. He himself was very scrupulous in his religiosity, but he advocated a version of Judaism that essentially said, look, we have accreted upon our practices many customs which are not necessarily rooted in traditional Jewish texts. They're just things that have sort of developed over time. And he argued that we should reevaluate where we are with our practices, and those practices which are not actually commanded or necessary, we should feel free to jettison them. And the reason we should do this is because with the growing movement towards emancipation of Jews, the allowing of Jews equal rights as citizens, which includes, for example, the right of residence to choose to live in a given place, which was not at all taken for granted in the 18th century. The right of marriage. In the 18th century, Germany had a very strict series of laws called the affiliation laws that restricted how many Jews would be allowed to marry. If you were a first son, you could marry. Second son, maybe not. And as a result, that many Jews from Germany actually emigrated to the United States in the 1840s because it was illegal for them to get married in Germany at the time. All kinds of really unfair discriminatory policies. And Mendelssohn said, with emancipation, we will free ourselves from these things, but we must essentially learn how to communicate with the society in which we live. We must master the German language. We must not shirk our civic duties. We must not see ourselves necessarily as living as exiles in Germany, but as part of Germany itself. His movement, known as the Haskalah, had tremendous success, particularly in Western Europe, as we shall see. Some other figures, like Solomon Maimon, whose career overlapped Moses Mendelssohn's, argued that it was impossible to achieve this, and the best we can do is simply jump ship and just abandon Judaism altogether. Many of the early maskilim, hello Benny, many of the early maskilim in Germany adopted conversion as their way of joining Judaism. Maimon happens to be especially interesting because he he came from Eastern Europe, and he actually tried to stay within Judaism, and he has a lot to say about his experiences in Lithuanian Judaism and also at the Tish of the Maggid of Mezrich himself. He records his impressions there. They are not positive impressions, and he ultimately ended up living a very unhappy life, nevertheless, which he recorded in an autobiography that we have of him today. The turning point in the Haskalah actually has a very bizarre kind of story. It happened that in 1772, there was a premature burial scare that swept throughout Europe. It took decades to subside. We even see evidence of it in the United States at that time, where, and by the way, it continues even this day. It's very rare, but it does happen that sometimes people's deaths are improperly recorded, and even the medical coroner might make a mistake on a death certificate, and then people have the terrifying experience of waking up, in a morgue. And so the Duke Friedrich of Mecklenburg-Schwerin said, okay, that's it. From now on, nobody gets buried until 3 days after the death certificate is signed. And this represented a direct challenge. And by the way, you can see that this is one of many artifacts from the period where you can actually, and people actually did do these things. They built coffins with little warning signals. Like on the left, the man who's lying there, he has kind of a bulb in front of him, and that if he happens to wake up in his coffin 6 feet under, he squeezes the bulb and a flag goes up. Sometimes there are little bells attached to your toes that you can ring the bell. Can you imagine walking by the cemetery and hearing the bell ringing? It's kind of scary. But and this was the rage for the last quarter of the 18th century because people were afraid of being buried too early. So this was a challenge, though, to the Jewish community because the custom is to bury Jews as quickly as possible. In Eretz Israel, of course, they try to do that within 24 hours because the whole decomposition process, al pi Kabbalah, is understood as a form of atonement. And so you want to accelerate that as much as possible. Obviously, we only bury dead people in Judaism, but sometimes mistakes might happen. So now the Jewish community was charged to forcibly wait 72 hours before burial. So the Jewish community of Mecklenburg-Schwerin went, and by the way, well, I won't go into this detail here. They went to Rav Yaakov Emden, a very notable authority, and they went to Moshe Mendelssohn to try and formulate a response to the community, to the legal authorities to avert this decree. Mendelssohn was the one who crafted the response, and he was successful. He did receive a Jewish exemption, maybe because, as Dara Horn likes to say, people love dead Jews, and therefore if occasionally you bury one a little too early, the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin was not too upset. But he wrote, by the way, privately that he says, listen, I'm going to defend the Jewish practice here, and he was successful. But he also said that, it's not such a terrible thing for us to accept this. And he pointed to, for example, a long-standing practice of Jews of practicing intermediate burial, like in these places called kochim, which we have in Beit Shan. We have them in Italy, many catacombs in which Jews were buried above ground, and like in caves. And then later, a year later, there would be a second burial, which would obviate the need. But nevertheless, he was successful. This gave a huge burst to the Hasidic movement, the Maskilic movement, saying that, yeah, we can work with society, we can work with science, we can actually propose public health measures that do not violate the standards of Judaism. Others, however, faced with the failures of the Maskilic movement to achieve immediate results, said, no, it's too late. David Friedlander, a student of Mendelssohn, actually said, you know what, after all said and done, they're not going to let us be citizens, so maybe we should just pretend to become Christians. This was something he called the dry baptism proposal of 1799, that we should just essentially go along to get along. We'll still do what we want to do, but maybe we should just say we're Christians. It turned out that was not very popular on an organized level, but it was adopted by many Jews on a primary level. While we're at it, I have to mention Samson Raphael Hirsch, shown here, who kind of took Mendelssohn's ideas and was able to sort of ratchet them back a bit to form the core of what we would call today modern Orthodoxy, sort of related to Samson Raphael Hirsch, who said that we should find that middle path between integration in society and preservation of Judaism. He's met with a lot of criticism. This is a photograph or an etching from his lifetime, but many people felt he didn't look frum enough, so later versions have him like this. Just a little bit more of a beard there. That usually gets a laugh. Thank you for noticing that. Okay, let's go to Eastern Europe for just a moment, where many of the variables are really quite different in Eastern Europe. German culture had a lot to emulate, a lot that Jews liked, and they wanted to become part of German culture. Jews never had the same degree of affection for Russian culture. It was considered, by and large, a peasant culture, not a literate culture. And when they had literature, like, for example, Dostoevsky, it tended to be rather anti-Semitic. Few notable exceptions, like, let's say, Tolstoy, but most were much more anti-Semitic. So there, rather than having assimilation and acculturation going on, you had a lot more new movements, like secular Yiddishism. Zionism becomes huge, Jewish socialism. But with regards to the fight between the Lithuanians and the Hasidim, perhaps the most significant figure is this individual, Joseph Pearl, who was an early Maskil in Eastern Europe. You can see, though, he's definitely very religious, wearing the kippah and so on. He ran a network of schools, and he felt that the best way to fight back against what he saw as extremely superstitious and backwards-looking Hasidim was to forge Hasidic stories which were patently absurd. And he hoped that people would read these Hasidic stories and they'd say, oh my gosh, those Hasidim are so stupid. What are they believing here? But it turned out it backfired because he sold a lot of copies. People actually liked them for the way they were. And so, it turned out it didn't work. But at any rate, to bring us to the rapprochement, basically what happens is, in the middle of the 18th century, Tsar Nicholas I gets very deeply involved in trying to solve what he considers the Jewish problem, that you have this big indigestible mass of Jews living in Western Russia who refuse to assimilate. And so he said, okay, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to put in place a new Jewish school system, which will essentially be a proxy for conversion to Russian Orthodoxy. He appoints this Western individual, Max Lilienthal, to set up the school system. Lilienthal, when he eventually realizes that it's a front for Russian Orthodoxy, he runs away to Cleveland, where he starts doing the same thing there. And also, terrifyingly, Nicholas I puts in place in 1837 a decree that will live right up into my grandfather's own generation, that Jews may be taken as children to serve in the Russian army for a period of service, 12 years in a military reform school called a canton, followed by 25 years of service in the Russian army, which was a terrifying prospect for any Jewish family. Here you can see a 1980 imagination of what it would be like taking away these Jewish children, 12 years old legally, frequently even younger. It actually added more impetus to the Hasidic movement, not only because, like eggs, Jews get harder when they are boiled, but also because the traditional Kehillah leadership was charged with the task of choosing which boys would be sent for conscription. And as you might imagine, the children of the rich and the powerful and the connected tended not to be chosen. The children of the poor, children of widows tend to be chosen, and that caused a wide-scale revulsion and an abandonment of Jewish youth from the traditional leadership, ultimately would contribute to the growth of Jewish socialist movements and revolutionary movements by the 1880s. But when we take all of this together, 1837 to 1914, there were some adaptations of the policy, but it began in 1837. But when we take it all together, and if you recall the joke that we opened with today, which speaks to the idea of identity formation, by the end of the 18th century and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, all three groups realized that although they had serious differences with each other, they had far more challenging opposition from outside the Jewish community. Nicholas I and his infamous Cantonist decree, the openly assimilationist movement that had degraded from the Haskalah. And so there was sort of a rapprochement, a coming together of minds, particularly of the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, who said, you know what, we may disagree about how to shecht a cow, but we agree that we should be keeping kosher. We may disagree about what time of day to daven, but we all agree that we should be davening. And so a rapprochement, which has basically held to the present day, has continued to be in place. And the Hasidim and the Misnagdim have even learned quite a bit from each other. Samson Raphael Hirsch's vision of a modern orthodoxy has thrived as well. And so the same debates of the 18th century involving the gorilla, the lion, and the giraffe continue. I will close with the words of Eliezer Zweifel, who wrote a rather remarkable book called Shalom Al Yisrael in 1868. And we'll quote here, God saw 3 shepherds, Rabbi Eliyahu in Lithuania, that's the Vilna Gaon, to safeguard the Torah, to purify its Talmud, and to oversee its logic and its diligent study. The Hasidim in Volhynia, which is sort of southwest Ukraine, to marshal devotion and to fan the embers of feeling. And the great sage of our people, Moses ben Menachem of Germany, and called him to place the cradle of enlightenment in the lamp of religion. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your endurance and your attention.
Start each day meaningfully. Click subscribe and hit the notification bell below for videos just like this.